You know, it's funny, right? We always think about like political violence being about groups trying to, like completely flip the script. But what we're looking at today is, well, it's kind of the opposite.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're diving into why some folks on the right, the ones who usually defend how things are actually the ones getting drawn to violence now. It's kind of a head scratcher when you really think about it.
It is. It really is. And I think the biggest thing to remember here is we're not talking about, every single person on the right. This article really zeroes in on a specific group, those who feel like, well, the systems, the ones they've always backed, those systems are failing them. Like they're not protecting their world anymore.
Yeah, it's like imagine looking around and seeing everything you believe in just crumbling. And you're standing there and you feel totally helpless to stop it.
Right.
The article, it really digs into this whole thing about the democratic process failing them. It even brings up Trump's presidency, which I
Okay.
thought was really interesting. It's like here you have this guy who's like the embodiment of their ideals, at least in how he talked, but they still felt let down.
Yeah. And that's a key point because the article talks about how, despite all of Trump's big claims, when you really look at the issues that mattered most to this group, like abortion or gay marriage, the actual victories were pretty slim.
Yeah.
Take Roe v. Wade, for example. I mean, yeah, Trump appointed conservative judges, but Roe was still overturned on his watch.
Right, right.
And that just fueled this feeling that, see, the system's rigged.
Yeah.
Even with one of their own in charge, nothing really changed.
Totally. It's almost like they're looking at the left, with their history of protests and activism, always pushing for change. And they're thinking, that seems to be working for them.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to step it up a notch.
And that's exactly it. This sense of urgency, this
Yeah.
feeling that the old ways just aren't cutting it anymore. That's a big part of what makes violence seem more attractive. They see it as the only way to shake things up, to make their voices heard.
Yeah, I see that.
And this is where COVID hits the scene. It's like, the article calls it throwing gasoline on an already burning fire.
Right. Yeah. Like that's when everything really exploded, right? I mean, it wasn't just theoretical anymore. This was about like their actual lives being turned upside down.
Exactly. And for these folks, the pandemic, it wasn't just some public health thing. It was like they were watching this dystopian future they'd always feared suddenly playing out in real time.
Yeah. Yeah. And all those restrictions, the lockdowns, especially closing churches while those Black Lives Matter protests could go on, that seemed to really hit a nerve.
Absolutely. The article talks about specific situations, like
Hmm.
churches couldn't even have people inside. They had to do services online, but protests were considered like essential. Talk about a double standard. It just reinforced that feeling that their values, the things they cared about, weren't just being ignored, they were being completely shut down.
Yeah, like their beliefs were under attack. And then, of course, we get to the vaccine mandates. It feels like that was a turning point in the article, almost like a symbol for everything this group had come to distrust about the government.
It was a line in the sand. You were either with them or against them. The article argues that for a lot of this group, it wasn't even really about the vaccine itself. It was about, well, do you go along with this? Do you just accept the government telling you what to do with your own body? Or do you refuse and risk, well, everything, really?
Yeah, your job, your place in society. It's like being forced to choose between your principles and your whole life.
Right. And you can see how that kind of pressure, that fear, could push people to extremes.
Yeah, for sure. The article even brings up the mark of the beast, from the Bible. Talk about intense.
And that's the point, right?
Yeah.
That comparison, it shows you just how high the stakes felt for them. Their freedoms, their values, their whole way of life, it felt like it was all slipping away.
So, like, where do we even go from here? The article makes it seem like these folks are trapped,
Yeah.
like stuck between a rock and a hard place, and neither option is good.
Yeah, it paints a pretty bleak picture for sure.
Hmm?
And the article lays out these two main paths, and neither one is, well, appealing. It's like, on the one hand, you've got resistance, you know, actively pushing back against the system they see as, like, totally broken. But that, as we've been talking about, well, that has its own dangers. Violence, becoming even more isolated.
Yeah, yeah. And then on the other side, is it even acceptance, really? More like trying to just exist in a world where everything feels like opposed to what they believe.
Right. And what the article suggests is that going down that path, maybe it's not as explosive in the short term, but long term, you end up with this deep sense of being disillusioned.
Mm.
Like they're strangers in their own country.
Huh.
And, that can be dangerous too. Could even push people further towards, well, extremism.
It's heavy stuff either way. But the article doesn't just leave us with this sense of doom, right? It connects all this, like the anxiety and distrust we see today, back to those historical examples of extremism. Like it even mentions guys like James Mason and William Luther Pierce, those who wanted to completely overthrow the government. I mean, that's chilling.
It really is a stark reminder that these feelings, if they're left to fester, well, things can get really bad. And I don't think the article's saying it's a perfect parallel, but it definitely makes you wonder if history could repeat itself.
hmm
How similar is what's happening now to what allowed those extremist ideas to take root before?
That's the question, isn't it? And it makes you think, like, what happens when people feel like they have no other choice?
Right.
When it seems like there's nothing left to lose? That's the conversation we need to be having, right? Not just about what's happening, but why. Because understanding that why, that's the first step to finding a different way forward. And on that note, that wraps up our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us for this important and honestly kind of unsettling conversation. But hey, that's what we do here, right? We dig into the tough stuff because ignoring it, well, that's not an option. So until next time, keep asking those tough questions,